Hello and welcome to Google Firestarters. I'm Neil Perkin, the moderator and curator of Google Firestarters. And for the uninitiated, Google Firestarters was a series of events we ran for about 10 years, actually, at Google, of course. And so we focus them really on the interesting and interested of the industry, the advertising and marketing industry, and of course, media industry as well. And so today's guest actually is no exception to that. I'm delighted to have Jerry Daykin, the Senior Media Director at EMEA at GSK, join us today. So, Jerry, would you care to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me back. Actually, I guess if you run an event for long enough, you can come on it a second time. But it's a great testament to that. Yeah, as you say, my current day job is I lead paid media and advertising across the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region for GSK Consumer Healthcare. Which, if you're not familiar with, it's kind of Sensodyne and Panadol and Voltarol and Centrum and a whole bunch of kind of largely over-the-counter healthcare products. I have a team of media managers in different markets trying to help us drive quite a lot of change as we shift the mindset of our business quite a lot to be more of a kind of forward-thinking, almost sort of FMCG advertiser rather than sort of the pharma business that we sit within. I've had an interesting history in the industry before that. I've bounced around largely client side, Diageo, Mondelez, did dabble agency side at Cara, Dentsu, a bit in the middle there, and I like to wear many sort of hats alongside my day job. I volunteer at a few different organizations, advertising, Conscious Advertising Network, and I'm part of the WFA's Global Media and Global Diversity Task Forces. So generally fairly passionate about how we have a better marketing industry, better media industry, not just in my own company, but much, much broader than that.
Brilliant. And thanks so much for being a part of Firestars again, Jerry. So as you know, we structure Firestars around 5 key questions. So those questions around the things that you've learned in your career to date, what's the biggest mistake you've made in your career, and your key insight around how the industry is changing, your prediction for the future, and then what's the question that you'd wish that I'd asked you. So I'm going to kick straight in, actually, if I may, with the first question here, and just ask you about the best thing that you've learned in your career to date. What's that?
Yeah, the best thing I've learned is definitely about keeping things simple. I think I've worked largely in the digital space, and I mean I have a total media job now, but I've done a lot of digital jobs along the way, and I think digital is an area where professionally we're not always that good at keeping things simple. When somebody asks you, when a brand person asks you about the possibilities of programmatic media, they often get hit by a wave of DSPs and SSPs and technical acronyms and cookieless world and all sorts of pieces, when really they were kind of trying to understand, what does this do for me? What does this do for my business? How can I use this? How does it help me better talk to and reach consumers? And in a whole bunch of things I've tried to drive in some of those different companies, including my current one, when you're trying to drive change and drive scale, there's a real secret in keeping things simple. And in particular, I mean, you obviously, especially if you're the media or digital expert, you need to understand an awful lot, and you probably have quite a lot of knowledge and technical details that you do understand. And my biggest suggestion is that you don't feel the urge to sort of vomit all that up to prove that you understand it all, but actually you prove your understanding in an even better way, which is by not mentioning any of it and talking about the sort of the strategic implications and the actually often tougher stuff that comes on top. And yeah, I think that I talk a lot about digital sense, which is kind of around that, bringing a lot of kind of more traditional marketing expertise and marketing science, applying that to what we do in digital, and really holding ourselves accountable that we keep things simple, because that you're never going to be able to drive a lot of change or persuade people to buy into your brilliant plans and schemes if you can't simply explain why they should do that.
Yeah, there's an interesting thought here, because I remember when you spoke at Firestarters before, you mentioned about how agencies can kind of overcomplicate things sometimes, and how actually sort of media, if you think about it, is actually a really pretty small part of a CMO's role and a job. And so the importance of kind of creating guardrails for marketers, just making it easier for them to say yes and to understand and invest and so on. So do you think that's really what agencies are guilty of here, trying to just overcomplicate things and talk things up too much, and perhaps to make more money out of it? I don't know.
No, I mean, not just agencies. I mean, in-house media teams can be just as cautious in that space as well. But I mean, definitely, I think that, you know, the brand managers who work with you know, media people agencies often have much broader jobs. They're often in charge of, you know, full innovation pipelines and PR and all sorts of other channels. And then kind of along comes media, which is, you know, an important one, a part that many people do enjoy leaning into, and, you know, where there is great opportunities to do interesting things. But if you kind of massively overwhelm them with complexity and opportunity and, you know, things they have to get their head around and frameworks and, you know, acronyms and things, I think it can make stuff quite tough. And I know in particular, I know agencies and, you know, strategists love the sort of the art of storytelling in a presentation to bring people along for the ride and to really kind of, you know, build up to a sort of final conclusion. But I sit through a lot of presentations where I feel like most people in the room who don't spend a lot of their time thinking about media don't really know what it's about for most of the time. And then there's sort of a big reveal at the end and they're like, oh, okay, so now I need to think about everything you previously told me. Whereas I'm just like, you know, keep it simple. And I mean, there are reasons to do that sometimes on big strategic points and stuff, but often I'm like, tell them what they're getting up front and then unpack it as you go. And it's a bit embarrassing in a way, but it is one of the, often I get asked, you know, why do marketers not do more with gaming, not do more with this emerging technology or this one? And one of the simple answers, you know, it's bandwidth, it's capacity, it's, you know, we need big scalable things that are relatively simple a lot of the time. And we can only devote so much effort to trying exciting new things, much as that's one of the more enjoyable parts of the job.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think you wrote something on LinkedIn actually, which is really good, about the 10 things I still hate about digital marketing. And having written quite a lot about digital marketing, and I think, you know, number one of that was the wizarding world of digital marketing, I think you called it. So do you think that digital marketing's kind of been in its sort of, if there is such a thing, has been its own worst enemy because of all the jargon and language that sits around it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. If there's such a thing, I mean, it's becoming it's just marketing these days, isn't it? But I mean, there's still digital specializations in it. I think we can be our own worst enemy in that sense. I think, I mean, I'm a massive digital advocate. I spend a lot of my time persuading brands and companies to do more of it. But I also look around and can understand why some of the messages we put out there, some of the complexity, some of, you know, you see people standing up on stages and you're saying that everything's changed. You know, the consumer only will buy from companies they have one-on-one experiences with. You know, consumers are leaning in, want to have direct relationships with brands. You know, TV's dead, you might as well just get rid of it. You know, it's, you know, just legacy companies clinging onto the past. You know, fairly reputable people in our industry sometimes stand up and say things almost as extreme as that. And, you know, you can understand why, you know, serious marketers and CMOs have challenge with some of those bits. And obviously the industry, the world is changing and, you know, new technologies exist. But generally, when you go around the supermarket and do your weekly shop, you're super happy not to have a one-on-one conversation with every brand you pick up. You're happy that your ketchup is Heinz and it does the trick. But, you know, you're not about to go home and, you know, give Heinz your national insurance number so that they can target you around the internet and things. So I think, you know, there's caution in the balance and the hyperbole about how much has changed. But of course, you can't ignore new digital channels and opportunities as well. You know, if we were all just literally ignoring it and just buying, you know, media the same way we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that would be bonkers as well. But it's finding that middle ground.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I once heard this called the idea of, like, because there was always a phase, I think, and it always happens, where you get the death of TV, the death of advertising, the death of this, the death of that, whatever. And somebody I know called it lazy-endism, which I think is a good way of phrasing it, isn't it? Because it is quite lazy thinking, isn't it? Just to think that because something new comes along, then the old is automatically finished or dead.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, I guess in a way you can't blame an industry of marketers for wanting to overhype things, because it's kind of in our blood, isn't it? That, you know, nothing is small and significant. Everything should be hyped as the next radical big transformation and all change. But yeah, it's, you know, it's a pretty good way of navigating most things in media and marketing, that they're extreme of opinions, and the answer is usually somewhere in the middle. So if, you know, someone's telling you, oh, you know, streaming is completely taken over TV, and someone's telling you, actually, I don't think it has, there's probably a bit of both in there, and the right solution is plans which balance that and recognize that. Yeah,
good. Okay, so staying with the theme of learning here, and but flipping it, and just thinking about what's the biggest mistake that you've actually made in your career, and what do you learn from it?
Yeah, well, that was a tricky one to work out what to answer. I've had a couple of smaller things where I've turned down a couple of jobs and things, and I've often looked back and thought, oh, was that a mistake? Should I have done that? But I know I'm happy where I ended up. And from a sort of sheer calamity perspective, when I was at Cadbury's, we managed to get the picture of a naked man with a cream egg on his bottom trending on Twitter. So I think that kind of goes in a things are going badly by the time you've achieved that. But it's probably a kind of a counter argument to the first one, which is, I think, and regrettably on the client side, where things have gone wrong a bit, it's often been in like politics and communications and not bringing stakeholders along for the ride. It's just I think for those, well, it's true in agency side as well, but I think client side in particular, we're big organizations with a lot of people who you need to keep updated and buy in on things, and where it's not necessarily one specific thing, but I've had a few times in my career where I've been like really driving a project or trying to drive a change, and then you haven't quite brought the right people along, or you've sent a kind of casual note to update someone on like a huge piece of work, not realizing how much it impacts their work and their view of things, and it kind of blows up in everyone's faces, and that kind of gets in the way of doing what you want to. So I think it's sort of it's in a way a similar point. As marketers, we pride ourselves on communicating to consumers and telling those stories, but we're not always as good at communicating in our own businesses across our own organizations on keeping our senior stakeholders updated on what we're doing, or sometimes when there's something you really, really want to do and you're crazy keen to do it, you have to almost adopt that sort of agency mindset, even internally, of like selling it into people and presenting why. So I think I've, it's not one major slip up, but I can think of, a number of times over my career where I've been frustrated or not been able to get to where I wanted to, or had, real big delays just because I didn't bring the right people along with me. And it can be a bit like herding cats, but that's where it links into the first point. If you make stuff simple and clear and communicate it well, then you can kind of swerve around that whole issue, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting is because having worked in large organizations as well myself, I think the idea of just sort of bringing people on the journey with you, and I think it's a mistake that I made actually in my career as well, when I've assumed that because I'm in that place and have that understanding or that view of the world, that actually other people have gone on that journey as well and they're in the same place. And the way in which you make a business case or something actually can just fall completely flat if you have that misunderstanding, that disconnect.
Yeah, and there are certain things where you have to be careful how you bring people along the journey with you. I mean, I'm quite a passionate advocate, as I sort of hinted earlier, for like marketing theory and how brands grow and marketing science, stuff like that. But and sometimes you're in meetings and you squirm a little bit because people are like, sharing stuff that you think, actually, I'm not sure that is true, or I'm not sure that does align with marketing science, or, is that really the direction we should go in? And as someone in a company, it is your job to try and steer things in the right direction and challenge that. But you have to find the positive way of doing that. You can't necessarily just, you see people on Twitter, shouting at each other on Twitter and saying, no, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. Like, science says this and science says that. And, you can't bring that mindset into a company. So, and there are lots of, funny projects that exist in big global companies around data and loyalty and all sorts of things that you might think, you having read one book, know all the answers to. But the answer is you have to, engage your colleagues on those things and try and understand what they're trying to drive, and try and understand how you can find a sort of mutual understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Okay. So let's get back to industry, because I'm really interested to ask this question around what you think is the key ways in which the industry itself is changing. So you're welcome to take that as marketing or advertising or media. So what do you think is the key ways in which there's so much going on, but what do you think is really happening here?
Yeah, I mean, we were already living in a fair time of kind of disruption, weren't we, before the crazy disruption we currently live in. I think there are some fairly big things that clients have been trying to, and some of it is sort of the ebb and flow that we go backwards and forwards of kind of global and local. But we definitely seem to be living in a world where clients were getting much more serious about kind of in-housing, bringing more capabilities internally. Lots of new agency setups, some of them, Martin Sorrell's new group and things like that, trying to meet that supply, and if not necessarily in-housing, because I think in-housing is sometimes an overly generous word for what ends up being, you know, still working with an agency, but they sit in your office, which now is their home anyway. But definitely, you know, challenging that way of working with agencies, and I think often in quite a positive way, because I think we sometimes create artificial silos between different agencies and even between internal and the agency. And this idea that if you can actually build a kind of a platform, a team where you're all working in the same direction and perhaps reduce some of those silos. I mean, some of it can be sort of hype and pitch spin, but I think some of it can, you know, really get you to better ways of working. So there was something there. I think for me that some of the most interesting stuff at the moment is everything that's happening in the world of you know, data and privacy, and you know, our good friends at Google have a lot to say on that. But without, you know, getting to the technical part of that, I think that's a really interesting conversation that I think is sending people off spinning in a lot of different directions. Right. A lot of companies, you know, you could spend your entire life now in webinars on like the cookieless future, whether you'd want to or not is not a good idea. And I think a lot of those are very focused on kind of a short-term change, you know, platform changes, technical things that are changing. But actually, if you ask the question, what is changing in the marketing industry? What is changing in the marketing industry is that digital is maturing much more broadly. Consumers have a higher level of awareness about, you know, what targeting is, what their data is, what they're comfortable with. That is leading to, you know, some of the stories in that space being front page news. It's leading to changing attitudes, which is what is driving regulation, what is driving this technical change. And so I think as an industry, sometimes we're spinning a lot at the moment, like how do I find technical workarounds to kind of specific changes? Whereas actually in a few years' time, I think we'll look back and see this was quite a big quantum shift in terms of the kind of advertiser public contract, what was acceptable. And I think, you know, we can spend quite a lot of time trying to swim upstream and, like, you know, cling on to some of what we have been able to do rightly or wrongly until now. And if you see the sort of the direction that is going in, and, you know, it's a question of embracing that. And none of that really undermines the opportunity of digital. There's still huge things we can do with context, with less personal targeting, with things. But for me, the big picture there is a quantum shift in kind of consumer willingness and participation in that, not just sort of lots of how do we work around cookieless rules. And that, I think, you know, will definitely define the next few years how the industry resets its thinking and its practices around that.
There was a really interesting piece you actually wrote about data, I mean, you were basically saying that the unpopular truth about data is that it's made marketing demonstrably worse. And there was actually a quote which I really loved in it, which was like the ancient mariner on the thirsty sea, we can find that the more data we drink, the more that we need, and yet our thirst is still not at all quenched. So I think, you know, the idea, we've got loads of data, so much data, and yet actually still marketing is not demonstrably better. So do you still feel like that? And if so, why?
I was aiming highbrow with my references there, wasn't I? Yeah, I do think, I mean, it's a sort of slightly deliberately sweeping statement that if, you know, various people in the audience are currently groaning at, it's not because I'm sort of super duper old fashioned and don't believe that data has arrived. I mean, clearly data has made certain things possible in marketing that weren't before. It allows, you know, huge performance businesses and wonderful things to happen. But I think there's sort of just a, especially in kind of the brand, you know, fast moving consumer goods world I've lived in, a sort of this sort of slightly weird sense that data is the answer to everything. We must have lots of data. We must, we must collect as much data as possible. And we'll kind of work out what to do with it later. And, you know, I'm happy to work in a company where we have something we call data for good, and we have a lot of thoughts about, like, what is the right amount of data, and how should we, you know, properly be, and to an extent ethically be looking at that. But I think, you know, generally there's a slight watch out that, you know, and I know not everyone loves their work, but the work of, like, people like Burnett and Field, that's shown, you know, that there has been decreases in marketing effectiveness as you know, the lure of kind of short-termism and chasing the lowest hanging fruit. And, you know, it's great to be there when the most perfectly targeted person is thinking about buying your brand, but they only got to that point because of lots of big brand building and stuff you did along the way. or even in terms of how we use data. Too often, I think when people say data, they jump to targeting. Like, we need to get lots of data on consumers so we can target them. Was actually getting data on consumers so you can understand much more bigger strategic things, shape your content, work out which platforms you need to be in, and how to be relevant to them, without necessarily being sort of super hyper targeted. I get quite nervous a lot about targeting, because I believe a lot in marketing science and how you grow your business by talking to people who are slightly harder to reach and not that bothered about you, and not necessarily just the kind of the low hanging fruit. So yeah, and I definitely see a future where data still exists and is still an important part of marketing. But I do think that the future marketing is a future with less data. We will have less data in the future, definitely in the EU. But I think globally, marketers will have less data in the future. I don't think we're fully prepared or acknowledging that. And it might still be the data we need, and we'll still be able to do a lot with it. But things are changing. There will be less data in the future.
I think one of the other things you mentioned there was about over targeting and under wastage, which is what you're talking about there. So maybe do you think really that there's not enough kind of insight really, and too much targeting going on? So too much kind of focus on this idea of hyper targeting and that sort of narrow type of
approach? I think it's definitely a watch out. That one of the things that that digital on the internet sold itself on was that hyper targeting opportunity. Was actually kind of secretly turns out that one of TV's greatest strengths is that it's not hyper targeted. So even if you have a really clear view on who your consumer is, you accidentally end up showing it to all sorts of other people. And yeah, sometimes we call that wastage, though actually, you could call it earned media, you could call it additional value. It's they may not be your heartland target audience, but they are people who it's worth talking to. And of course, there are times where the people who are leaning, there certainly, it depends on your product, on where it fits in a consumer journey. People can have products with very specific target audiences that only people of a very certain type of person, a certain mindset, a certain is going to buy. In which case, of course, there is huge power in being able to target and limit those people. Even in those industries, it still pays to build your brand outside of that narrow group of people, because the people in that group is forever changing and new people are coming into that group. And if they've never heard of you and never understood you, you're starting from scratch. But yeah, I just think that it's not that I think targeting is all bad and should be thrown out. It's just there's a real caution that, like, when we on traditional media, when we say I'm kind of looking at this audience, and then you buy it, you get some other people around it. But on digital, sometimes you literally get that audience, or at least we think we do. I know data isn't always perfect, so perhaps we do get more of that kind of additional audience than we realize.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to ask about context here as well, actually, because that's the other sort of tricky balance here, particularly in relation to data. And there was an interesting tweet, actually, which you put out recently, was where you're saying contextual advertising is caricatured as a step back to a kind of basic, less data-driven approach. But actually, you were saying it's often much richer in the moment data of specific interests, relevance, opportunities. So it's actually more data in a way, which is an interesting sort of dichotomy, isn't it? So, I mean, do you think where does it stop? Where's the balance? If you want to understand somebody's context, you need to understand quite a lot about them, perhaps. So, privacy and all the rest of it comes to there, doesn't it? So, where's the balance there?
I'm starting to get a bit nervous about my own privacy. How many of my tweets have you read? I mean, I know they're public, but if we're going to talk to them all, we'll have to have a part of this conversation where we talk about the Eurovision Song Contest as well, because I tweet quite a lot about that. But yeah, I think I'm a big fan of context in many ways. Partly because I think when you have a focus on context, you end up with a focus on quality and placement and being in the right place at the right time. And aside from data and targeting, I think our industry is a slight challenge that we've lost sight of the importance of, like, what you appear alongside and where you appear. Like, we're too focused just on, like, it's the right person. And you can imagine, like, you're trying to sell a football related product. Do you buy data from Amazon to find who shopped football boots in the last 3 months and target them wherever they are on the internet, which might be when they're looking at the latest ITV soap news or something? Or do you just advertise on, like, football news sections and things like that? And I know data is is sometimes seen as a way of getting that audience more cheaply. Like, you know, you want this sort of super premium audience that is, you know, really in demand. Like luxury goods is a great example, and you know, you can bring it into the real world. Like if you're trying to sell someone a really fancy handbag, you know, actually having a store in a sort of luxury shopping center is quite expensive. But you know, so it feels like a great plan to sort of identify someone who's shopping those stores, and then, you know, find that same person who's clearly, you know, in the market for a handbag. You know, when they pop to the toilets, why don't you try and sell them a handbag there? Because, you know, it's much cheaper there. You can pull out your handbags and try and sell it, but no one's going to buy an expensive handbag from you in a toilet. And that's where we end up a bit in the, and that's like a Tom Goodwin kind of analogy I think he makes. And I think there's something about context that, you know, brings that quality. And also, yeah, I don't know, we talk about context like, yeah, it's going backwards and it's old school planning. But actually, context now can be so much richer, because you're not just saying, you know, I want to be on this TV show. Like when, you know, websites have huge amounts of data on, and there's a lot of, you know, keywords, partners, you know, metadata where you can, you know, I've seen case studies where it's not just I want to appear on a recipe website, but I want to appear on a recipe website for a website that someone is clearly cooking for a romantic meal. So therefore they're in that mood. You know, context doesn't have to be basic and simple. It can be really nuanced, and, you know, the kind of super personalization, because, and I think personalization based on context always feels more real, because if you show me an advert about football just randomly on the internet, I probably just think it's sort of a generic advert that happens to use football, and, you know, I might like football, I don't really personally, but whereas if it's on that website, it's like, oh wow, look, you know, I'm thinking about football, there's an advert about football, love it when a plan comes together. So yeah, I think for whatever reasons, some of us lost sight of the, you know, the value and opportunity of context, and I think it will come back, not least because it's one of the ways around this weird cookieless future we face.
Yeah, I mean, I think often my reflection, I think, is that a lot of the basics are missing sometimes with execution and just you know, the kind of retargeting and frequency control and things like that. And I think you've actually mentioned this before as well, and just sort of frustration about some of the basics just not being there sometimes. Do you think that the industry is a bit guilty of that? I
mean, the industry, we're all kind of guilty of wanting to do the shiny new thing, aren't we? Of like, you know, wanting to be testing and learning and trying something new. And you know, in my own day job, I run this sort of EMEA region, so it's, you know, a vast empire of, you know, the UK and Germany down to South Africa and Pakistan, and, you know, these are very, very different markets with very different digital maturities. And it's interesting because, you know, we share like interesting best practice, and you find some markets are relatively new to trying some of these things, trying to be really, really cutting edge and doing these like super advanced test and learn and stuff. And I'm always a bit like, well, it's great you're doing that, but we have this whole bucket of like proven stuff that we know works, that we know delivers, that we know will, you know, help you drive sales and help you grow your brands. And you're not doing any of that necessarily yet, or not doing all of that yet. I don't want to disparage any of my fabulous markets. You know, why don't we get you doing more of that basic stuff that we know that works? And even I think in media in general, we have a slight tendency to sort of want to overcomplicate things. Like every campaign we want to do like a really advanced connections planning. We want to have a workshop. We want to really talk it through. You know, we've, again, the way our business works, we have, you know, hundreds of different brand market combinations. And sometimes if the brand is relatively small and the budget is relatively small, I'm like, you know, we've got some basic golden rules of how you could run that plan. And, you know, 95% of the time, that's going to be a good thing to do. You don't need to massively overcomplicate and do crazy things. And then, you know, when we have more headroom, when we have bigger budgets, when we have you know, bigger opportunities, then sure, then you build in the, you know, trying new things, some of the more sexier stuff. And I think it's getting a bit of that balance, because nobody wants to kind of feel that their media plan is like a plan, you know, paint by numbers plan. But at the same time, you know, your market is probably quite similar to several other markets with the same brand, with the same challenge. Learn from them, embrace them, and put your time into doing the sort of the bits that are different.
Brilliant. So I'm just going to ask you to think about the future now. And so what's your key prediction for the future of the industry? So again, you can take that as marketing, media, advertising, but where do you think we're going?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've hinted at it a bit in talking about some of the sort of the shift, I think, in terms of consumer perceptions around privacy, and that's sort of possibly a reset in media there. But I think ultimately what we face is a world where digital is becoming just part of the marketing mix, where we've been talking about digital for 30 years now or something, and radio is digital and TV is digital, everything is digital, and I think that hopefully brings a bit of maturity where we get back to kind of key like integrated media plannings, where you have more people with you still need specialists and deep dive knowledge, but I think there's ever increasing value in kind of strategists and minds that can really span that full media mix and bring stuff back together. You might even see that a bit with some of the consolidation. I talked a bit about, it's not necessarily about agencies consolidating, but, bringing blended teams, which do bring, media and digital and creative and stuff back together, and teams that we've kind of split up to, for various reasons, actually working much better, more closer together. And dare I say it, probably with more agility. And I sort of mean that in a, there's literal agile, isn't there, where you're working in a sprint and things. I think that is, a part of the future of media and marketing, but I think it won't be all of it. But definitely bringing some of that stuff back together, seeing some of those channels maturing so that, they're not treated as sexy, shiny new things, but they have to deliver in the same way that other parts of your media mix do, and they are evaluated often in similar ways, looking at not just engagement and likes and things, but like actual sales lift and brand lift and stuff. We've talked for a while that we're sort of living in a golden age of marketing with new channels and new shiny things, and I think we've lived actually through quite a messy age in marketing for the last decade or two. And now maybe we start to get to that golden age where we get better at seeing how those channels work together, where we get less distracted by shiny and new, because, although there are new-ish platforms, most of the sort of the opportunities that exist have been around now for a decade or so. The Facebook, Twitter. I mean, you get a TikTok or something that's kind of new, but it's not that different in many ways to other platforms. But yeah, I think it's sort of a maturity, and hopefully with that a lot more sense, I'd like to think, in the industry. But I just some of the things we already touched on, I definitely see a world where we have less consumer data, not more. And that doesn't necessarily mean that marketing won't continue to feel more personalized and relevant and engaging. It just means we'll go about it in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting what you're saying there about different disciplines sort of working together much more and more concurrently, I suppose. So, I mean, what do you think you're really getting out of that situation where you've got creative and working much more closely with media and, all of those disciplines that are involved with that, just working together much more concurrently?
Yeah, it is a challenging thing to navigate, because in a big global business like the ones I've worked in, Diageo, GSK, Mondelez, there's partly because of effectiveness, but also getting to the best product. You often end up with worlds like global brand teams creating global creative, and then local teams landing and activating, and you get a sort of a slight disconnect and lose some of the nuance there. Now, I absolutely think we can go to the other extreme, and you have brands producing huge amounts of kind of hyper local content, trying to be like super relevant and jump on every social moment and things like that. And it's not about that. But there's definitely a really rich territory where those two pieces come together. I mean, it's obvious things saying like your creative needs to be fit for and formatted for the channels it appears on. And sometimes we interpret that quite simply, like has to be vertical or horizontal, and we need a brand in the first 3 seconds and things. But there's much more to it than that. Definitely in terms of grabbing people's attention, keeping people's attention, and I actually think especially. Most businesses live in a slightly more frugal world of marketing that we used to. It can be hard to justify like big shoots and big opportunities. And there's some really interesting things that come when you blend media and market and creative together, like, partners you could, media owners you can work with who will both create the content and the reach for you, that, you're therefore literally shaping content that perfectly fits their audience and amplifying it back to it. And I think you just get to some really really rich places. I mean, there's still huge value in having a really powerful, impactful, maybe globally created TV asset, but I think there's also richness in really planning how that content, that media comes together. And we're changing some things in our own organization to try and be more agile, to have more internal teams able to bring that together, to work together on that. Not that we're completely getting rid of our external agencies, but just trying to explore how that looks.
Of course, brilliant. Okay, so we're running short on time, unfortunately, but let me ask you the final question, which is my kind of catch-all question, really, which is what's the question that you wish that I'd asked you, and what's your answer to it? So let me ask you that.
I usually enjoy talking about like diversity and representation, inclusion in kind of the broader sense. Like I said at the start, I wear quite a few hats in that space, and I think in the sort of the media space in particular, I think it's really interesting to consider, yes, of course, there's the diversity of our teams and our colleagues and inclusion, that kind of thing, which is super important. But I also think in our, in the current teams we have and in the roles we have, what we do with our money also has a big role to play in that story that I don't think always gets as much attention as it deserves. I think, there's been lots of talk in the industry about improving our creative, trying to have creative more representative, but you can apply a lot of those challenges to media as well. Like what are we funding? And obviously, there's been the downside of that, which is, brand safety and, trying to make sure you're not misfunding hate speech and things like that. But there's also an absolute upside of that is, are you deliberately funding the good stuff? Like, are you helping fund journalism? Are you helping fund positive stories about minority groups, either in mainstream news titles or in dedicated minority publications? Because ultimately our media fuels and funds the internet, and so therefore if we accidentally give all of our money to kind of clickbait websites and celebrity plastic surgery, that's what the internet becomes. And if we commit to wanting to spend behind maybe better things, we have a degree of influence over shaping what content exists, what editors choose to write stories about, and what exists in the world. And I think there's something really positive there, not least because adopting that mindset guarantees you really good, positive, rich context. So everything we talked about earlier about being relevant, finding ways to appeal to different audiences, you can adopt this mindset and it's kind of win-win for your business and for funding society. So yeah, I could talk endlessly about that topic, but I think I'm super passionate about all sorts of different areas in diversity and representation, but thinking that the role that media planning and strategy and buying has within that is a really interesting territory, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just maybe dig into that a bit more, because just focusing on the industry itself, and I think there was one phrase, I'm going to quote another phrase that you've written, I'm afraid, but so there is one thing you said in one of your pieces about when we talk about solving the diversity problem, we really mean embracing the diversity opportunity, and I really like that. So what did you actually mean by that? Describe what actually the industry can do better.
Yeah, and I mean, we do have a problem of an extent that we don't have the diversity we need to. We don't talk to the right diversity, but diversity brings such value that it's really an opportunity. The agencies that are getting more diverse, richer teams, they have richer perspectives. It's slightly forced, but you will increasingly see clients building into their RFPs and their pitches and things like they want to understand the diversity of the agency they're working with, what they're doing to improve that. But yeah, as I say, it's not just about the teams; it's what we put out there. And as I say, all of that stuff about having more representative, creative, more representative media approaches. I mean, it does a good thing for society. There's research that shows that exposure to progressive advertising, does move people's beliefs in a positive direction. But it's also like it's a business opportunity. Like they're growth audiences to appeal to audiences who perhaps haven't been well communicated to before, who you haven't properly presented your product to. There's huge relevance opportunities if you can do that contextual thing, appear in the kind of spaces that matter to these audiences. I think there's just it's kind of a win-win opportunity around doing a good thing for society and doing a good thing for your business, to make sure that it's our job as marketers to talk to and reflect as broad an audience as possible. And so it's a huge opportunity for those moving into that space, and to making sure they are doing that.
Fantastic. I love that thought. And unfortunately, I think we're out of time, but thanks, Jerry. It's been super insightful. And thanks again for being part of Firestarters. Of course.
Pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, no problem. And thanks to everybody, of course, for watching. Don't forget to like and share the video, of course. And so my thanks again to Jerry, and look out for future episodes of Google Firestarters. Thank you.